Hey there. I want to chat a little bit today about the concept of fear of magical failure, which I think is the sort of thing that is fairly ubiquitous. Most people will experience to some extent or another during the course of their practice. The extent to which people will experience this varies, but in some cases, one's reaction to it can be really negative and sort of lead one to an extreme response. For instance, that fear of failure may mean that you never get around to trying certain things because you're afraid it won't work. Or failure itself, from trying all sorts of things, corrodes your confidence in yourself, your confidence in your path. And in that case, you can end up in this vicious cycle where you fail to distinguish between the practice of your path and the underlying tenets of your belief system, what you're trying to achieve. And so you end up confounding these issues in, I think, much the same way that people may confound finding their path and figuring out what they believe. And certainly fear of magical failure is something that I've experienced, and I wanted to talk a bit about it and offer some of my insights, opinions that may be helpful, and possibly hear back from others regarding what this means for them and how they react to it now. So just right off the bat, we can start with one absolute guarantee, and that guarantee is that you will fail. Not everything you do will work. And rationally, realistically, I think most of us would recognize that and do recognize that. Most of us embrace the idea that learning something new necessarily involves failure, that skills have to be developed in order for you to be good at them. We can talk about natural aptitude till you're blue in the face, but natural aptitude just determines the starting off point. If you want to progress anywhere, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to do a bad job from time to time. You're going to fail in some ways. And depending on how expansive your craft is, how many things you try to do, how many different realms you attempt to learn and have influence on, well, your innate capacity to do things in those different realms is going to vary. Witchcraft isn't one skill. It's a constellation of skills. And you're very unlikely to be good at all of them right off the bat. Yet despite understanding that this is how things work, that this is how we have experienced learning throughout our entire lives, most of us don't like failure, and some of us are better or worse at reacting to failure. In general, I think we are by and large worse at dealing with failure when we perceive the stakes as being high, when we interpret that failure as being significant in terms of repercussions and a reflection of something else, some belief, assumption, what have you, that we consider very important. And so when you're talking about a spiritual practice, something as off the beaten mainstream path as spell work, failure can carry all sorts of additional baggage, like this isn't real, the reason this doesn't work is because I'm deluding myself, I'm an idiot for having tried, and I should just quit all of this nonsense. But I think that in many cases, that reaction can be a massive overcorrection. And so I'd like to dive into some of the thought processes and assumptions that are going on when one has that sort of reaction. Failure, regardless of context, is really the sort of thing that I think we benefit from framing differently in most cases. And in particular, I think recognizing that failure is an overarching term that we apply to an attempt to do something, whether it's regarding your spirituality, your work, your playtime. And by concluding that the entire event is a failure, we are very often disregarding all the many smaller successes that ultimately didn't result in the goal that we were actually looking for, but were nevertheless successful and beneficial. So if you've ever tried to work a spell and came at the other end concluding that the whole thing was a failure, I wonder how many of the things that you engaged in before, during, and after that ritual became guilty by association in your head. Perhaps your circle casting was absolutely on point, your visualization crisp and effortless, the energy build intense and vivid, and yet because you didn't get the ultimate outcome you wanted, none of those things mattered. But they do matter, because all of those things are skills that you were practicing and you did a good job at. And even that greater failure of not getting the outcome you wanted from your spell, as disheartening as that sort of thing is, what does that really mean in your head when you conclude that you failed? Are you thinking that it can't work, or that you could never make it work, or that the entire thing is just physically impossible? There's this oft-quoted line by Thomas Edison, and whatever you may think of him, I really have to say that I do enjoy this quote, and it's, "I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." What I like about it is the recognition that there are a lot of things that won't come easily, and that persistence is the only means of really figuring out whether you can pull something off. And look, let's be real here. If you're a witch, you're operating on uneven and treacherous territory. The fact that I'm a witch doesn't mean I don't believe in the laws of physics. I do think that there are things that are impossible, but there are a whole lot of things that I suspect are incredibly improbable that I will try anyway. But I go in with my eyes open, recognizing and embracing the idea that it might not work, and it might not work for all sorts of reasons, and that failure in this particular context isn't catching, doesn't spread and taint all of the other things I do that do work, that I do feel have a more firm footing in terms of mechanism. I think of these improbable spells as boundary testing, and although I engage with them, I do only do them in moderation. My particular approach to the craft is heavily based and informed by psychology, and I recognize that confidence bolstered by successes feeds my power and keeps my working effective. And so repeatedly failing, undermining my confidence in that particular way, is not something I want to do too often. So when it comes to pushing yourself in that area, reaching out into territory that you don't know, that you're less confident about, I think a more conscientious and steady approach, but not a defeatist one, is a good means of allowing yourself the freedom to explore that territory without letting it get you down if and when it doesn't work. So let's go back to this idea of things that are impossible. I'm going to assume that we all agree that there are some things that are simply physically impossible, and yet that most of us share the opinion that a lot of things that we don't understand may be possible. That there are things that are difficult to pull off and therefore are infrequently successful. If you used 100 copies of me to test the hypothesis of whether it's possible to return a tennis ball that's being served at me at 120 miles an hour, you would conclude absolutely that it's not possible, because there is no way in hell my racket would ever connect with that thing. And yet there are many, many people who can do that. Individuals have remarkable capacity to affect the world around them, influence themselves and others. And in some cases we understand why that is. In others, our understanding is much fuzzier. We chalk a lot of it up to practice or innate ability, but we don't necessarily know what that innate ability entails or what practice really means. What are they practicing exactly? We don't have firm models for how that stuff works. And so when we test those things ourselves, we're often flailing around in the dark, just trying stuff out. There is a difference between theory and practice, but the less solid the theoretical foundation, often the less efficient the practical attempts to pull something off are. Speaking of models, I'd also like to add that whatever magical models you're using, they're wrong. And my models are wrong too. And whether you're talking about climatology, magic, or neural processing, the models are wrong. They're imperfect. It's built right into the definition. A model is an approximation, an estimate of how something functions, and there are no models that capture every variable at play. And just as importantly, there are very few fields that rely on a single model for how everything in that field works. A classic and easy example of this is physics, where the models used to explain objects with a large mass are completely different from the ones used to explain stuff at the quantum level. The two models aren't appropriate for the same task. And I think this is another thing to consider when faced with repeated failure at some sort of spellcraft. If you embrace the idea that spellcraft, magic, your practice is complex, then you really have no reason to believe that a single model adequately explains everything you attempt to do. Likewise, there's no compelling reason to believe that the same model you use to work your job hunting spell is going to be just as successful at your stop my kids from having nightmares spell. But if you're applying that same solitary model every time to every problem, well, of course, you're not going to be as successful at all of them. And so failure in this case doesn't necessarily reflect some lack of capacity on your part, or the inherent difficulty of pulling off one spell versus another, but merely that you're using the wrong tools, the wrong approach, which is why those 10,000 attempts are so important. Why figuring out what doesn't work is as valuable as finding the stuff that does. And this is the sort of thing you can really approach from an analytical standpoint. If you keep a record of what works and what doesn't, you can go back and analyze that data. Figure out what commonalities are shared between the spells that have worked really wonderfully for you off the bat, the stuff that hasn't worked as well. And I'm not just talking time of the month or ingredients or the details of the spell, but the foundational model upon which you built that spell. Speaking of failure as a reflection of one's capacity to pull something off, I think another reason failure can be very biting is that when you aspire to greatness and success, coming away feeling like you have less control or less power or less talent than you hoped or believed can hurt. But once again, we're still talking about skills, right? There are all sorts of things there that are learned. And accepting failure the first time around, or the second, or even the third as evidence that you cannot do it fails to account for the learning curve, for improvement with practice. It also fails to consider that a new perspective is sometimes all you need to tweak in order to make something work. How many of us have been absolutely befuddled by some stage magician's trick or a puzzle? How many of us have tried to work it out for an hour and gotten nowhere? And at the end of that hour, how many of us have thought that we just weren't smart enough, or it required something that we didn't possess? And then when somebody showed us how that trick works, how many of us went, holy shit, of course, obviously. The trick was never beyond our capacity. It was never particularly hard, but our perspective when observing it was too limited. It really was nothing but a matter of perception, and that slight tweak, that moment of realization, took us from being an abject failure at this thing to understanding exactly how to pull it off and being able to do it ourselves. Well, those realizations, those tweaks in perspective, can also be won by repeated trial. And those are exactly the circumstances in which accepting failure is a mistake, because then you really are losing out. You're giving up on something that you were just millimeters away from attaining. But because it was difficult to gauge just how close you were, it seemed like you had miles to go. Now, of course, there are lots of things each of us will get better at with practice. But let's not pretend that we will get better at everything. Our capacity to improve in that way depends on many things, including the model we're using, our existing skill sets and abilities, inherent facility with a technique, and also, like we agreed before, some things are just fucking impossible. Those are not things that are going to stop being impossible. But when it comes to improving one's spellcraft, at reducing the fear of failure, the same advice that you'd give somebody trying to figure out a career or a hobby or a sport applies. Play to your strengths. What are you already good at? When you figure that out, find something that you think is just adjacent to that and push your limits in that direction. See how that turns out. It's easier to learn to be better at something we're already adequate at than to pick up brand new skills. And assuming we're not trying to break some of the fundamental physical laws of the universe, we're liable to have greater success when we test new waters that way. It doesn't guarantee success, of course, because something that on the surface may seem like it's closely related to stuff we're already good at might be one of those things that a different model, a different approach is really optimized for. But that sense of familiarity, at the very least, will help lower your inhibitions, which can be a source of self-sabotage when we're trying something new. A final note when it comes to this idea of playing to one's strengths. That adage applies to individuals, but frankly, I think it applies to the entire species as a whole as well. There's a tendency that I think most of us humans share. We devalue what we're good at, which is like a corollary of the Dunning-Kruger effect. And we are incredibly enthusiastic about the stuff we're not good at. In spellcraft and magic, this manifests as a lack of appreciation for outcomes achieved through mental, often self-manipulation, and an over-enthusiasm for anything that appears to violate the laws of physics. And don't get me wrong, I too would love to be able to blow on a candle and light it on fire. But that's never gonna fucking happen. And if it did, I would then save myself the trouble of using matches from time to time. The things I can do are improve my odds of getting jobs, of making friends, of making money, of learning new things, of finding a tribe, of finding fulfillment, of experiencing wild and wonderful things. And those are all things, those are all abilities that play to my strengths as a human, and which are so much more valuable and meaningful than a party trick. We have these big, glorious brains. We are designed to be masters of the mental domain, and we are so lucky that we can be. So if part of your fear of failure involves feeling bummed because you can't pull off trivial tricks, it may be time to incorporate reminders in your practice that you do have superpowers. You're just so used to having them that they've lost their shine. As ever, I welcome comments, discussion, and I wish you a lovely night.